The wind howled through the towering pines, its icy breath carving through the valley like a specter searching for lost souls. The world outside was blanketed in white, a vast and merciless expanse of snow stretching into oblivion. The cabin, small, weathered, and barely distinguishable from the frozen wilderness, stood alone, swallowed by the endless silence of the Montana backcountry. Inside, Ethan Carter sat motionless in his worn-out armchair, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. The fire in the stone hearth flickered weakly, casting long shadows that crawled up the wooden walls, creeping like memories he had tried to bury beneath years of isolation. He had lived in this solitude for almost a decade, tucked away in the depths of Bitterroot National Forest, where no roads reached, where no neighbors knocked, and where time itself seemed to stand still. The world he once knew, the world of sirens screaming in the night, of burning wreckage, of lives slipping through his fingers, was nothing more than a ghost that haunted his sleepless nights. He had come here to disappear, to forget, to drown the echoes of his past in the vast and unfeeling wilderness. Yet, even out here, in the unforgiving grip of winter, some things refused to be forgotten. A sudden thud outside made Ethan's entire body stiffen. The sound wasn't natural, wasn't the wind, wasn't the groaning trees struggling against the cold. It was something else. Something alive. His pulse quickened, his breath slowing to a measured stillness. He knew the sounds of this land, could decipher the whispers of the forest as easily as he once read the grim expressions of paramedics in the back of an ambulance. This was wrong. Setting his mug down with quiet precision, Ethan reached for his rifle, an old but reliable Winchester that had kept him safe from wolves, from cougars, from the rare but desperate bear scavenging too close to his home. He moved cautiously to the window, his boots making the floorboards groan beneath his weight. Outside, the snow was pristine, except for the tracks. They were small, almost delicate, half buried beneath the fresh layer of powder that had fallen overnight. His breath clouded the glass as he leaned in closer, his sharp eyes tracing the erratic pattern of the paw prints leading straight to his porch. Then, the sound came again. A cry. Weak. Fragile. Dying. Ethan exhaled slowly, his grip tightening on the rifle. He had lived here long enough to know what that sound meant. It was an animal, and it was suffering. For a long moment, he did nothing. He should stay inside. He knew that. The wild had its rules. He knew that. But something about the sound didn't let him walk away. Carefully, he unlatched the door and stepped onto the porch, the cold biting into his skin like a punishment. The air was thick with the scent of snow, crisp and sharp, as if the world itself had been frozen mid-breath. And then he saw it. A bear cub. It was barely more than a shadow against the white, its small body trembling violently, its breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Frost clung to its fur, its paws red and raw from the ice. But it wasn't the state of the cub that made Ethan's heart clench. It was the way it looked at him. Those eyes, deep, dark, and wide with something Ethan had never seen in a wild animal before, were pleading. Ethan had encountered bears before, had seen the wild, raw power in their gaze, the instinctual wariness that kept them alive in a world where the strongest devoured the weak. But this was different. The cub took a step forward, then collapsed. The sound it made as it hit the snow wasn't a growl, wasn't a cry of pain. It was something worse. It was surrender. Ethan's entire body locked up. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was not meant to get involved. He had learned that lesson the hard way, too many times. People who tried to play savior always ended up losing themselves in the process. He should turn around. Should go back inside. Should let nature take its course. But his feet didn't move. His hands didn't let go of the rifle. His eyes didn't leave that cub. The wind roared around him, rattling the trees, whispering warnings into his ears. And still, he couldn't look away. Because deep in those desperate, glassy eyes, Ethan saw something he hadn't seen in years. He saw himself. A lost soul. A creature abandoned by the world. a life hanging by a thread, begging for a reason to hold on. And in that moment, Ethan Carter did something he knew he would regret. He dropped the rifle. He pulled off his heavy coat. And as he bent down, scooping the frail, trembling cub into his arms, feeling its frozen body curl into his warmth like it belonged there, Ethan Carter broke his own rule. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that this single act of defiance would change everything. Because once you save something, you become responsible for it. And sometimes, the things you save refuse to let you go. The silence of the wilderness was absolute. The kind of silence that didn't just settle around a person, it wrapped itself around them, seeped into their bones, became a part of them. Ethan Carter had learned to live in it, had grown to depend on it, but tonight, something was different. The storm had finally begun to ease, though the bitter cold remained, gripping the land in a frozen chokehold. The sky above was a heavy shade of slate, scattered with stars that flickered dimly, swallowed by the oppressive weight of the clouds. Snowflakes still drifted lazily through the air, catching the moonlight in ghostly patterns, and the vast wilderness around him lay buried under layers of ice and frost, a graveyard of frozen silence. And then it came. A sound that didn't belong. Ethan's body tensed instantly, every muscle in him coiling tight. It was faint at first, a fragile whimper, lost in the vast emptiness of the night. It wasn't the distant howl of wolves, nor the eerie snap of ice-laden branches under the weight of something unseen. This was something else. Something small. Something suffering. The wind surged, howling through the skeletal trees, threatening to steal the sound away, but Ethan had already heard it. And once something like that reached a man's ears, it was impossible to ignore. For a long moment, he stood still, his breath clouding the air, his mind screaming at him to turn back, to leave it alone. The rules of the wild were simple: interfere, and you become part of it. Out here, mercy was just another word for weakness, and weakness was a death sentence. But then the cry came again. Weaker this time. More desperate. Ethan felt it before he even knew what he was doing, the tightening in his chest, the slow, aching squeeze of something he had spent years trying to kill. Instinct. Not the instinct of survival, but something older, deeper. The instinct to save something that could not save itself. Cursing under his breath, he grabbed his coat from the hook by the door, throwing it over his shoulders as he stepped onto the porch. The cold hit him instantly, slamming into his body like a fist, sharp and unforgiving. He exhaled, and the breath that left him turned to mist, curling in the frigid air before vanishing into nothing. The snow beneath his boots groaned as he moved, crunching under his weight as he took a cautious step forward. His cabin's porch light flickered weakly, casting a dim glow across the frozen ground, illuminating the scene before him. And then he saw it. A small, dark shape, barely visible against the endless white. Ethan's heartbeat stilled. The cub was curled into itself, a shivering, pathetic mass of fur, half buried in the snow. Its breath was ragged, labored, each exhale sending up tiny puffs of steam that barely reached the freezing air before dissipating. It was young. Too young. Bears this size weren't supposed to be out in the dead of winter. They were supposed to be tucked away in dens, buried in the warmth of a mother's fur, safely hidden from the merciless cruelty of the cold. But this one was alone. And Ethan knew what that meant. He felt his stomach twist, a sick realization crawling up his spine like ice water. A cub without a mother in winter wasn't just lost. It was doomed. His grip tightened on the railing of the porch, his knuckles white against the frost. He should turn back. He knew what would happen if he took another step. He knew what it would mean. But then, as if sensing the weight of his hesitation, the cub lifted its head. Their eyes met. And something inside Ethan snapped. The cub's eyes were glassy, unfocused, black pools reflecting the dim glow of the cabin's light. But there was something else in them. Something human. Pleading. Begging. And then it collapsed. Ethan moved before he could stop himself, his boots crunching through the snow as he strode forward. His breath came in harsh, visible clouds, his pulse hammering against his ribs. The cub was barely conscious now, its small body shuddering with the last remnants of strength it had left. Its fur was stiff with frost, its paws red and swollen from the ice. Ethan could see the slow, uneven rise and fall of its chest, could hear the weak, strangled sounds it was still trying to make. A cry. A plea. A question with no words. And then there was nothing. The cub went still. For a split second, Ethan's mind froze, the kind of freeze that had nothing to do with the cold and everything to do with the horror of watching something small, something helpless, slip away right in front of him. His body moved before his mind did. He dropped to his knees, his hands reaching for the cub before he could even think about what he was doing. The second his fingers touched its fur, he felt the cold in a way he had never felt it before. It wasn't just cold. It was wrong. The cub's body was like ice, its small frame barely rising with each struggling breath. The warmth was already leaving it, stolen by the merciless winter that had already claimed so much. Ethan didn't think. He acted. Without hesitation, he shrugged off his coat and wrapped the cub in it, pulling the tiny, frozen creature against his chest. He could feel the slight tremors still running through its body, the weak, uneven heartbeat beneath layers of ice-stiffened fur. "You're not dying tonight," he muttered under his breath, though he had no idea if he was speaking to the cub or himself. Pushing himself to his feet, he turned back toward the cabin, his arms locked tight around the fragile weight in his grasp. The storm was still screaming through the trees, the wind clawing at his face like an unseen predator, but Ethan didn't stop. He couldn't. Because once you made a choice like this, there was no going back. And even as he stepped through the doorway, into the warmth of the fire's glow, he knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The weight of the cabin door in Ethan's hand felt heavier than it should have, as if something unseen was trying to stop him from stepping back inside. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was both. The fire had burned low, its embers pulsing faintly, casting a dull orange glow against the log walls. The storm outside still raged, rattling the window panes and howling through the cracks like a ghost demanding to be let in. But inside, the world was quiet, except for the weak, unsteady breaths of the bear cub cradled in Ethan's arms. He moved quickly but carefully, his boots leaving a trail of melting snow as he crossed the room and knelt by the fireplace. The heat from the dying fire barely reached the edges of the cabin, the cold still lingering in the air like an uninvited guest. Ethan adjusted the cub in his arms, feeling the small, fragile body tremble against him. The coat he had wrapped it in was damp now, soaked with melting snow and ice. Too cold. The cub was still too cold. Ethan's jaw clenched as he stripped off his gloves and placed the cub onto the floor, right beside the fire. It made no sound. Didn't move. For a split second, something sharp and unwelcome gripped his chest. He'd been too late. Then, a twitch. A faint, involuntary shudder rippled through the cub's body, as if the warmth had finally begun to register. Its breathing was shallow, weak, but still there. Barely. Ethan exhaled, unaware he had been holding his breath. The cub was alive. But for how much longer? His fingers, rough and calloused from years of labor, moved with unexpected gentleness as he peeled back the damp coat, revealing the cub's matted fur. Frost clung to its tiny whiskers, its paws raw from the cold. The small, fragile ribs expanded and contracted with each shallow breath, and up close, Ethan could see just how thin the cub was. Had it been starving before the storm even hit? The thought made his stomach turn. A cub this young wouldn't have survived on its own for long, even in the best conditions. But this storm, this relentless, merciless winter, had sealed its fate the moment it was left alone. Ethan reached for the firewood beside the hearth and threw another log onto the embers, stirring them back to life. Flames licked hungrily at the new wood, crackling and popping, the cabin filling with the faint scent of burning pine. He held his hands to the heat for a moment before rubbing them together, then hesitated. There was one more thing he could do. It was reckless. It was stupid. But he did it anyway. Carefully, cautiously, he extended his hands toward the cub's small body and pressed them against its fur, trying to transfer whatever warmth he could. He expected the cub to flinch, to jerk away, to react like any wild creature would when touched by a human. But it didn't. Instead, it curled into him. Something lodged itself in Ethan's throat. He swallowed hard. He shouldn't be doing this. He knew that. There were rules out here, rules that kept a man alive. He had spent years obeying them, following them without question. You don't interfere with nature. You don't bring a wild animal inside your home. You don't get attached. Because once you do, once you take responsibility, there's no going back. But what was he supposed to do? Leave it out there to die? Pretend he hadn't heard those cries, hadn't seen those eyes staring up at him, pleading for something it didn't even understand? He clenched his jaw and pushed himself to his feet. This was temporary. He would warm the cub, let it rest, and then tomorrow, when the worst of the storm had passed, he would take it back outside. It would leave. It had to. Ethan moved to the kitchen, his body running on muscle memory as he filled a metal pot with water and set it on the stove. The sound of the fire crackling filled the silence, but it wasn't enough to drown out his thoughts. This was a mistake. It was all a mistake. He grabbed an old towel from a drawer and crouched down beside the cub again, gently patting its fur to absorb the moisture. It let out a faint, almost inaudible whimper but didn't resist. The trust in that small, broken sound made Ethan's chest ache in a way he wasn't prepared for. He worked in silence, his hands moving methodically, almost numbly. The towel came away damp, flecked with ice and dirt. He grabbed another, continuing until the cub's fur was no longer stiff with frost. Still, the small body trembled. Still, those tiny paws twitched. And then, after what felt like an eternity, the cub's breathing steadied. Ethan sat back on his heels, watching as the small creature lay curled beside the fire, its tiny body rising and falling in a slow, fragile rhythm. For the first time since he had brought it inside, he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, it would make it through the night. But what then? What happens in the morning? Because if this cub survived, if it found the strength to wake up, to stand, to move, it would still be alone. And that realization settled into Ethan's chest like a weight he didn't want to carry. The fire crackled louder, sending flickering shadows dancing across the wooden walls. Outside, the wind had begun to die down, but the world remained cloaked in ice, the snow stretching endlessly into the dark. Ethan leaned back against the edge of his chair, his gaze fixed on the small figure curled beside the fire. He told himself, again and again, that in the morning, he would do what needed to be done. He would take the cub outside. He would set it free. He would walk away. Because that's what a man does. That's how you survive. But even as he thought it, he knew, deep down, he had already lost. Because when you save something, when you hold something so small and fragile in your hands and feel its heartbeat slow, feel its body lean into yours for warmth, for safety, it changes you. And Ethan Carter had spent his entire life running from change. But now, change had come knocking at his door. And it had refused to die in the snow. The first rays of morning light pierced through the frost-covered window, casting a dull glow across the cabin's wooden floor. The fire had burned low, its embers pulsing like the heartbeat of something alive, barely clinging to warmth. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind a silence so thick it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Ethan Carter sat on the edge of his chair, his elbows resting on his knees, staring at the small, unmoving form curled beside the fireplace. The bear cub hadn't left. It should have. Any other wild animal would have seized the first opportunity to escape, to flee back into the vast wilderness where it belonged. But this one? It was still here. Still breathing. Still curled up in the very spot where he had placed it the night before, as if the fire's warmth was the only thing keeping it tethered to life. And maybe it was. Ethan ran a rough hand over his face, exhaling slowly. He hadn't slept. Not really. Every time he closed his eyes, he'd found himself listening, waiting for the cub's breathing to change, for it to stop. He had convinced himself he was only keeping it alive until morning, just long enough for the storm to pass. But now that morning had come, what was he supposed to do? The cub shifted slightly, a slow, lethargic movement, its tiny limbs stiff from the cold it had barely survived. Its fur was still damp in places, but the frost was gone, melted away by hours beside the fire. Ethan watched as the cub's eyelids fluttered, its small body shivering once before finally, slowly, it lifted its head. And then, it looked at him. Ethan felt something twist inside his chest. The cub's eyes, deep and dark, weren't wild. There was no fear in them, no instinctual panic of a trapped animal. Instead, there was something else, something Ethan hadn't expected. Recognition. It was subtle, just a flicker of awareness in those wide, searching eyes. But it was there. The cub blinked slowly, its body still sluggish from exhaustion, and then, as if it had decided something Ethan himself hadn't, it moved toward him. Not away. Toward. Ethan barely had time to react before the cub, still weak, pressed itself against his boot, curling its small body around his foot like it had always belonged there. He went completely still. He could feel its warmth through the worn leather of his boot, the fragile tremble of life still fighting to hold on. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. This was wrong. It wasn't supposed to act like this. Wild animals didn't seek comfort from humans. They didn't trust. They didn't. The cub let out a small sound, something between a sigh and a whimper, and Ethan felt whatever argument he had left collapse. He closed his eyes briefly, exhaling through his nose. He had to get it out of here. Now. Gently, but firmly, Ethan reached down and lifted the cub, his hands encircling its small body as he carried it toward the door. It was surprisingly light, all bones and fur, its heartbeat rapid beneath his fingers. The moment his hand touched the doorknob, the cub whimpered again, soft, but desperate. Ethan hesitated. He told himself it wasn't hesitation. He told himself he was just thinking, just making sure this was the right decision. But deep down, he knew. He knew that once he set this cub outside, there was no undoing it. This thing, this bond, it wasn't real. It couldn't be. The cub was young, confused, clinging to the first source of warmth it had found. That was all. Nothing more. But as he slowly opened the door, the cold outside rushing in like an unforgiving whisper, he felt it tense in his hands. And then, it clung to him. Its tiny claws gripped at his sleeve, its body pressing against his chest, and Ethan froze. No. Not like this. The cub should have scrambled away the second the door opened. It should have fought to escape, to return to the only world it had ever known. But instead, it did the one thing Ethan wasn't prepared for. It held on. And something inside him broke. For a long moment, Ethan just stood there, his breath slow, measured, his pulse hammering against his ribs. His fingers tightened around the cub's frail body, his mind screaming at him to let go, to push it away before it became something more than just a life he had saved. But it was too late. Because deep down, he already knew. He wasn't the one holding on. The cub was. And that single, devastating truth changed everything. The sky was a bruised shade of gray, stretched taut over the endless wilderness, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Snow clung stubbornly to the branches of the pines, sagging under the weight of winter's relentless grip. The air was thick with silence, not the peaceful kind Ethan had grown accustomed to, but the heavy, unnatural kind, the kind that meant something was wrong. He hadn't meant to wander this far. He told himself it was just a walk, a simple trip to check the traps, to gather firewood, to clear his head, but deep down, he knew better. Something had been gnawing at him for days now, a feeling he couldn't shake. An unease that had taken root ever since he found the cub. No matter how much he tried to ignore it, it lingered, coiling around his thoughts like smoke. And now, as he stood at the edge of the frozen clearing, staring at the half-buried remnants of a collapsed den, he understood why. The cub's mother had never left. She had never abandoned her child. She had died here. The realization hit Ethan like a punch to the ribs. The snow around the den was disturbed, torn apart by desperate claws, scattered with the faintest traces of something darker than ice. The entrance had caved in, a silent grave in the middle of nowhere, forgotten by everything except the one she had left behind. His breath left him in a slow, visible exhale, curling into the air before vanishing. He swallowed, his throat tight. How long had the cub been waiting? How many nights had it curled up against the frozen body of its mother, confused, starving, unaware that she would never wake up? Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, his fingers curling into fists inside his gloves. He could picture it too easily, the tiny creature, alone in the snow, pressing itself against the lifeless form of the only thing it had ever known, waiting for warmth that would never come. A sharp gust of wind howled through the trees, whispering something he didn't want to hear. No one had come for her. No one had come for either of them. Until now. Ethan exhaled, forcing his muscles to loosen, forcing himself to move. The cold was starting to creep in, burrowing under his coat, but he barely felt it. His eyes remained locked on the den, his feet refusing to take another step closer. There was nothing he could do for her. Nothing he could change. But the cub. The cub was still here. Still breathing. Still looking at him with those wide, trusting eyes that Ethan had tried, and failed, to ignore. He turned away from the grave and started back toward the cabin, his steps heavy, his mind drowning in the weight of what he had seen. This changed things. It shouldn't have, but it did. Because now he understood. The cub wasn't just a lost animal. It wasn't just something he had rescued from the cold. It was something that had been waiting to be saved. And Ethan Carter wasn't sure he was strong enough to be the one to save it. But as he pushed open the cabin door, as the warm air rushed to meet him, as he saw those small ears perk up, those dark eyes lift to meet his, that frail body still curled in the same exact spot where he had left it, he knew one thing for certain. The cub had already decided. And Ethan. Ethan had just run out of reasons to fight it. The storm had passed, but the cold had not. It clung to the land like a predator, lurking in the trees, creeping into every crevice, waiting to claim anything too weak to fight it off. The morning light barely stretched across the sky, a dull, colorless haze that did nothing to warm the frostbitten earth. Ethan stood at the cabin door, staring out at the endless expanse of snow. The stillness of the wilderness should have brought him comfort, it always had before. But now, that silence felt different. It felt heavy. Behind him, the cub stirred. Ethan heard the faint rustling of movement, followed by a small, sleepy huff. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself not to turn around. Not to look. Because looking meant acknowledging what he already knew. He had made a mistake. A mistake that had paws, dark eyes, and no intention of leaving. The cub had survived. Against all odds, against the cold, against nature itself, it had survived. And now, it was looking at Ethan like he was something more than just the man who had pulled it out of the snow. Like he was the reason it had survived at all. That was the problem. Because he wasn't. Ethan Carter had spent the last decade alone. By choice. By necessity. He had built his life around one simple truth: the less you care, the less you lose. But here he was, standing in his doorway, staring out at the wilderness as if it might hold the answer to a question he had been too afraid to ask. What now? The cub had to go. That had always been the plan. He had told himself that from the beginning. He was not keeping it. He had only done what any decent person would do, helped a dying creature, given it a chance. That was all. But now, as he turned back toward the fire, toward the small, fragile body curled up on the floor, he felt that truth slipping through his fingers. The cub blinked up at him, still groggy from sleep, its tiny frame stretching before it let out a deep sigh and pressed closer to the warmth of the fire. Ethan's chest tightened. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Wild animals didn't behave this way. They didn't trust like this. They didn't seek out warmth that wasn't their own. But this one had nowhere else to go. And somehow, it knew that. Ethan ran a hand over his face, his fingers lingering at his temple as if trying to rub away the tension that had taken root there. The right thing, the only thing, was to take it back outside. Now. Before it got any more comfortable. Before it started to think of this place as something it could call home. Because it wasn't. Ethan wasn't its mother. He wasn't its protector. He was just a man who had found it in the snow. But as he took a step toward the cub, as he reached down to pick it up, it did something that made his entire body lock up. It nuzzled into his touch. Not out of fear. Not out of instinct. Out of trust. Something in Ethan cracked. He felt it, deep in his chest, as if the weight of something unspoken had just settled there, refusing to be ignored. He pulled his hand away. The cub blinked at him sleepily, unfazed, before closing its eyes again. And Ethan, the man who had spent his life running from things like this, stood there, his own breath slow and measured, as the truth finally caught up to him. He had broken his own rule. And he wasn't sure if he could fix it. The fire crackled softly, its warmth stretching through the cabin, filling the space with a quiet, steady presence. Outside, the cold waited. But inside, something had changed. Ethan just didn't know what to do about it yet. The night was thick with silence, the kind that pressed against the walls of the cabin like a warning, waiting for something to break it. The wind had died down hours ago, leaving the forest unnervingly still, as if the world outside had taken a breath and refused to let it go. Ethan Carter sat at the table, staring at the flame of the oil lamp flickering in front of him. It cast long, distorted shadows against the wooden walls, their movements eerily alive. His hands rested on the surface, fingers curled into loose fists, his jaw tight as he listened. He could feel it before he could hear it. A shift in the air. A presence beyond the trees. Something was out there. Watching. Waiting. The cub, Jack, as Ethan had unknowingly started calling him, was curled near the fireplace, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, blissfully unaware. The fire crackled softly beside him, throwing a glow over his fragile frame, but the warmth that had once seemed so safe now felt exposed. Ethan's fingers twitched toward his rifle. Then he heard it. A low, distant howl. His body went rigid. It wasn't close, not yet, but it was enough. Enough to tell him what he already suspected. They were here. His chair scraped against the floor as he stood, every movement controlled, deliberate. He crossed the room in silence, moving toward the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see out into the frozen darkness. The moon was high, casting silver light over the snow, stretching the shadows of the trees into jagged fingers. The world beyond the cabin looked untouched, undisturbed. But it wasn't. Ethan's breath was slow, steady. Listening. Waiting. The howl came again, closer this time. And then, another. Two. A third. Ethan clenched his jaw. A pack. His stomach twisted as he let the curtain fall back into place, his hands resting on the windowsill. Wolves didn't come this close unless they had a reason. Unless they were hungry. Unless they sensed something weaker than themselves. His eyes flickered toward the cub. Jack stirred slightly but didn't wake, his small body tucked in on itself, lost in sleep. Ethan turned away from the window. He had two choices. He could leave the cub outside. Let nature decide. Or. His fingers brushed against the stock of his rifle. He could fight. The thought made something deep in his chest tighten. Damn it. He had been alone for so long. So damn long. And now, here he was, standing between something fragile and the teeth waiting to rip it apart. His grip on the rifle tightened as he moved toward the door, his steps soundless, his heartbeat anything but. He wasn't sure if the cub was truly asleep or if some part of him knew that whatever was about to happen, it wasn't meant to see it. The cold slammed into him the second he stepped outside. The sky stretched vast and endless above him, the stars nothing more than distant, uncaring spectators. The snow crunched under his boots as he stepped onto the porch, the breath leaving his lips in visible clouds. And then a shadow moved at the tree line. Ethan stilled. The forest had eyes. They watched from the darkness, from the spaces between the trees, waiting. A pair of glowing orbs reflected the moonlight, then another, then three more. They weren't charging. Not yet. They were testing. Measuring. Sensing hesitation. Ethan lifted the rifle, not aiming, not yet. The lead wolf took a step forward, its form slipping from the cover of the trees. Its fur was a mixture of grays and browns, blending seamlessly with the night. It moved with the kind of confidence that came from knowing it wasn't alone. Ethan's pulse hammered against his ribs. He wasn't afraid, he had faced worse, but this was different. This wasn't just about him anymore. A second wolf emerged. Then a third. Too many. Ethan exhaled through his nose. He had a rifle. He had 6 bullets in the chamber. He could end this now. But if he did, more would come. This wasn't their land. It wasn't his. It belonged to something older, something merciless. And tonight, that something had come to collect. The lead wolf took another step, its muscles coiled beneath its thick coat. Closer now. Ethan's finger hovered over the trigger. Then, from behind him, a sound. Soft. Small. A whimper. Ethan's stomach turned to stone. He didn't have to look. He knew. Jack was at the door. His tiny frame was barely visible in the darkness, just a shadow against the dim light spilling from the cabin. But the moment he made that noise, the wolves heard it. Their heads snapped toward him, ears perking. Ethan's blood ran cold. The leader lowered its head, eyes locked on the cub. No. Ethan didn't think. Didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, in front of Jack. His boots planted firm in the snow. His rifle raised. The lead wolf snarled, a deep, guttural sound that cut through the silence like a blade. But Ethan didn't move. The air between them felt stretched tight, a moment balanced on the edge of something irreversible. The wolf took another step. Ethan's hands didn't shake. He knew what came next. A test. A fight. A death. Something had to give. And then, it did. The lead wolf's ears flicked, its nose twitching slightly. Its eyes flickered, not to Ethan, but past him. Jack. Ethan's pulse pounded as he heard the cub shift behind him, small paws pressing into the wooden floor of the cabin's porch. And then, something Ethan never expected. The cub, Jack, made a sound. Not fear. Not submission. Something else. A low, unsure growl. It was weak, barely more than a vibration in the frozen air, but it was there. The lead wolf hesitated. Its ears twitched again, its body shifting slightly, uncertain now. For a second, a breathless, impossible second, Ethan saw something strange in its eyes. Recognition. Not of him. Of Jack. The leader exhaled through its nose. And then, without a sound, it turned. The others followed. One by one, their glowing eyes disappeared back into the darkness. Their forms melted into the trees, swallowed by the night, vanishing like ghosts. The silence returned. Ethan exhaled, his breath sharp, his heartbeat still too fast. He lowered the rifle, his fingers stiff from the cold, his mind racing. Jack was still standing behind him, his small body tense. Ethan turned. The cub blinked up at him. And for the first time since this all began, Ethan realized something. Jack hadn't been running from the wild. He had been running toward something else entirely. The wind had died sometime in the night, leaving the world outside the cabin in a suffocating stillness. It wasn't the peaceful kind, the kind Ethan had long since grown used to. This was different. This was the kind of quiet that pressed into his chest, that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, that whispered something had shifted. Ethan sat at the worn wooden table, his fingers wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. He wasn't drinking it. He wasn't even sure why he had made it. Maybe it was a habit, something familiar, something to anchor him to a world that was slowly starting to feel unrecognizable. Across the room, the cub lay curled beside the fire. Jack. Ethan hadn't wanted to name him. He had spent days, weeks, telling himself that this was temporary. That the cub was still wild. That he would leave, that Ethan would make him leave. But Jack wasn't leaving. And Ethan hadn't made him. The past few days had been a blur. The wolves had come and gone, leaving behind a question Ethan still couldn't answer. Why had they left? Why had they hesitated? Why had they turned away instead of taking what should have been an easy kill? Jack had stood there, small and trembling, but something in the way the wolves had looked at him, it hadn't been hunger. It had been something else. Something Ethan didn't understand. And he hated not understanding. Ethan ran a hand over his face, exhaling sharply through his nose. This had to end. Jack needed to go back to the wild. He needed to. He had survived the worst of the cold. His body had grown stronger, his steps steadier. He could walk, he could hunt, he didn't need Ethan anymore. So why did the thought of opening that door make Ethan's hands clench into fists? A sudden sound broke through the silence. Not loud. Not jarring. Just small. A whimper. Ethan looked up. Jack had moved, uncurling himself from his place by the fire. He stretched, his small frame shaking off sleep, before his dark eyes found Ethan across the room. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Jack blinked. Then, before Ethan could stop it, he padded toward him. It was slow at first, hesitant, the way an animal approaches something unknown. But there was no fear in his movements. Just a quiet certainty, as if this wasn't a question, as if he wasn't waiting for permission. Ethan swallowed, his throat suddenly tight. Then, Jack did something that made his entire body lock up. He pressed himself against Ethan's leg. Not out of fear. Not because he was hungry or needed warmth. But because he wanted to. Ethan's breath hitched. His hands curled around the mug, gripping it as if it might somehow hold him together. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. Wild animals didn't do this. They didn't seek out human comfort, they didn't stay when they were strong enough to leave. But Jack wasn't leaving. And Ethan wasn't making him. Something burned behind his ribs, something he hadn't let himself feel in years. This was why he had left the world behind. This was why he had chosen solitude, why he had buried himself in a life where nothing could attach itself to him. Because once you let something in, once you start caring, it becomes part of you. And losing something that had become part of you, it was worse than anything else. Jack made a small noise, pushing himself further into Ethan's leg, and something inside him cracked. His free hand, traitorous, reckless, moved on its own, resting lightly against the cub's fur. Jack sighed, pressing into the touch. Ethan closed his eyes. He could end this. He could take Jack into the woods right now. He could walk him out into the snow, set him down, and leave. He could pretend none of this had ever happened. But his fingers tightened slightly in Jack's fur, and he knew. He wasn't going to. Because the truth was, Jack wasn't the only one who had been alone for a long time. And maybe, just maybe, he had been waiting to be saved, too. The snow had started falling again, quiet and relentless, covering the forest in a thick, suffocating blanket of white. It wasn't the heavy, punishing kind that came with the storms, this was something softer, something slower. Something deceptive. It was the kind of snowfall that erased tracks, that swallowed footprints, that made it seem like nothing had ever existed beneath it. Ethan Carter stood on the porch, his breath rising in thick clouds against the freezing air. His coat was pulled tight around him, but the cold still found its way in, sinking into his bones, settling there. Jack sat beside him. The cub was bigger now. Stronger. His fur had thickened, his small frame no longer as frail as the night Ethan had pulled him from the snow. His eyes, once wide and glassy with exhaustion, were sharp now, filled with something that was neither fully wild nor fully tame. Something caught in Ethan's throat. He had known this moment was coming. Had felt it creeping closer with every passing day. But now that it was here, his fingers curled into fists inside his gloves. He had told himself from the beginning, this wasn't forever. Jack wasn't his. He belonged to the wilderness, to the trees and the rivers and the sky. Ethan had saved him, but he had never meant to keep him. And yet, Jack had stayed. Through every open door, every moment Ethan had stepped outside expecting him to be gone, he had stayed. And now, Ethan was beginning to wonder if it had ever been Jack who needed saving at all. The cub shifted beside him, his small ears twitching as he lifted his head to sniff the air. Snowflakes clung to his fur, melting against the warmth of his body, disappearing as if they had never been there at all. Ethan swallowed. It was time. He reached down, resting a hand gently on Jack's back. The cub leaned into it. A slow, quiet exhale left Ethan's lips. He had lived alone for so long. So damn long. He had built walls around himself, not just the wooden ones of this cabin, but the kind that kept people out. The kind that kept him from feeling things, from remembering things, from hurting. But Jack had walked through those walls like they weren't even there. He had curled up beside Ethan's fire, followed him through the woods, rested his head against his leg like he belonged there. Like Ethan was his. And now, for the first time in years, Ethan wasn't sure if he could go back to the silence that had come before him. The snowfall thickened. Jack let out a small, quiet sound, a sound that wasn't quite wild, wasn't quite tame. A sound that felt like something in between. Ethan's chest ached. Jack had survived the winter. He was ready now, ready to leave, to run, to live as he was meant to. But Jack wasn't leaving. And Ethan wasn't making him. Because maybe the wilderness wasn't just trees and snow and wind. Maybe, sometimes, home was something else entirely. The snow had stopped falling by dawn, leaving the forest untouched, pristine and quiet, as if the world itself had paused. The early light stretched long shadows across the cabin's porch, filtering through the trees and slanted beams of gold, illuminating every delicate breath of frost that clung to the branches. Ethan Carter stood at the edge of the clearing, his boots planted firmly in the snow, his heart hammering against his ribs. His breath curled in front of him, disappearing into the morning air, but his hands, his damn hands, wouldn't stop shaking. Jack was standing a few feet away. The cub was bigger now, stronger, wilder. His coat had thickened with the winter months, his body no longer frail like the night Ethan had found him in the storm. He had grown into himself, into what he was meant to be. And that was why this had to happen. Ethan had known it from the start. He had told himself, over and over, this wasn't forever. Jack was never meant to stay. And yet, here they were. The cub stood in the snow, ears flicking forward, his dark eyes locked onto Ethan with something he didn't want to name. Something that made his throat tighten, his breath turn sharp, his chest feel like it was being pulled apart from the inside. Jack was waiting. Ethan swallowed hard. He had to say something. Do something. But his voice, his damn voice, was gone. The past months played in his mind like a reel of film, flickering too fast to stop, too vivid to ignore. The first night by the fire. The hesitant steps that turned into trust. The way Jack had followed him through the woods, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. The way Ethan had tried so damn hard, to keep his walls up. And the way Jack had walked right through them. His throat burned. This was the right thing. It had to be. Jack wasn't a pet. He wasn't something to be kept, to be tamed, to be made into something he wasn't meant to be. Ethan had saved him, but Jack had never belonged to him. He belonged here. In the wild. In the place where his mother had been lost, where the wolves had come and gone, where the trees whispered of things Ethan would never understand. His hands curled into fists at his sides. Jack took a step forward. Ethan stiffened. No. Don't make this harder. The cub let out a soft, low noise, not quite a growl, not quite a whimper. Something in between. Something close to grief. Ethan clenched his jaw. His chest felt like it was caving in. You have to go, he said, his voice hoarse. Jack's ears flicked. He tilted his head slightly, like he was listening. Like he was trying to understand. Ethan forced himself to look away. If he didn't, he wouldn't be able to do this. He turned toward the trees, toward the endless stretch of untouched wilderness. He could feel Jack's eyes on him, could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on his spine. His next step felt heavier than anything he had ever done. Then another. And another. The trees swallowed him whole. Ethan walked, kept walking. His hands trembled. His breath came in sharp, unsteady bursts. He didn't stop until he knew Jack was out of sight. And then, finally, he let himself break. His hands came up, pressing against his face, his breath coming ragged, his chest aching in a way he hadn't felt in years. This was right. It was. Jack would be okay. He had made it this far, he would survive. Ethan had done his part. He had saved him. He had done what was right. Then why did it feel like he had just lost everything? A sound, soft, familiar, broke through the silence. Ethan's breath caught. His hands dropped to his sides. Slowly, he turned. And there, standing at the edge of the clearing, his dark eyes unwavering, his small frame poised between the wild and the life he had known, was Jack. He hadn't left. He had followed. The world stopped. Ethan stared, his heart pounding, his body frozen in place. Jack took a step forward. Then another. And then, before Ethan could stop it, before he could force himself to turn away again, Jack closed the distance between them. He pressed himself against Ethan's leg. And everything broke. Ethan sank to his knees, his breath leaving him in a sharp, unsteady exhale. His hands, his traitorous, reckless hands, moved on their own, gripping Jack's fur, pulling him close. Jack didn't resist. He just stayed. Ethan's fingers curled into the thick coat, his body shaking from something that had nothing to do with the cold. This was wrong. This was all wrong. Jack should have left. He should have run. But he hadn't. And Ethan wasn't making him. Because maybe, just maybe, neither of them were ready to be alone again. Not yet. Not ever.